We thought it might be good, given this is a day really on philosophy, as you may have noticed, devoted entirely to the philosophers. We just thought it might be good to put a non-philosopher, that's myself, right in the middle of the day, and to be very practical. Maybe especially after lunch, we just need something down to earth, very practical. And that is the question: in practice, how do scientists go about the business of trying to extract truth, if you like, out of the natural order, out of the world around us? And so I'm a practicing biologist, not in the sense I do any experiments myself at the bench, although I used to until quite recently. But I do have a team of postdocs working, I know, 2:05, yes, they'll be back at the bench, busy in the lab, pushing back the boundaries of science this afternoon, just down the road, and working away in the field of immunology and cancer research. And so what we're talking about here is something very practical. Now, of course, scientists are very human and indeed very fallible beings like anybody else. I'm always absolutely amazed at how very heterogeneous the scientific community is. I mean, scientists are definitely not clonal, when you look at them. So we have a Nobel Prize winner here in Cambridge. He cycles to work every morning in a T-shirt. And you might not think that's very unusual, but he does that also in January, February, March, right? I think it may be the same T-shirt, actually, right the way through the year. And not apparently, no. So, this is being filmed. I'm not naming any names here. And if you look at the average laboratory, I mean, it contains voters for all the major political parties. It contains introverts. It contains computer geeks, I have to say, socialites, depressives, exuberant people, shy people, and just merely sort of placid people. And you have the complete range of humanity well expressed and well represented in every laboratory, and anyone who's worked in a lab knows what I mean there. And if you go to my lab down the road here, I mean, first of all, you'll find Radio 1 blaring out all the time. It would drive me crazy if I had to work in the lab now. So that's the background noise. You've got continuous chat going on. You've got laughter. You've got, I'm glad to say, serious discussions about techniques and about data going on. You've got frequent grunts. You've got cursings when things go wrong. You've got occasional moments of great pleasure when an experiment works really beautifully and you just get the result that you want. That's the kind of environment where I spend my days and where I spend my life. And if you've just had the news, that your recent manuscript has been turned down by a top journal, you can go off to the toilet for a little while, you can grieve there in solitude, and then you have to come back and face the boring task of getting your manuscript ready for submission elsewhere. That's the reality of the scientific community. So it's a very human community. Science is a very human enterprise. Now, along with our social heterogeneity, virtually all scientists, I would say, are critical realists of one kind or another. We've been hearing about realism this morning. Now, of course, scientists don't know that they're critical realists because they don't know any philosophy, except, of course, the group here, accepted. But very often, if you go out in a lab, they're not scientific. Scientists, as a general rule, are not that educated in philosophy. But actually, if you explain to them what critical realism is about, then I think most scientists would say that's what they are. In other words, they believe that in their science, they're obtaining better approximations towards a true understanding of the world. When you think about it, no scientist in his or her right mind would sweat long hours in the lab for low pay, write endless grants, papers, struggle with techniques and instruments that don't work very well, wrestle over conflicting data, experience the disappointment of someone publishing their results before them in some other journal. They wouldn't go through all that pain and suffering unless they actually believed that their work was providing information about the real world, reliable information that tells us something a little bit closer to the truth out there in the real world. To that extent, effectively, as I say, I think all scientists are actually, or the great majority, are realists at heart. Now, the word critical then separates off this view from the type of realism that was perhaps much more popular at the end of the 19th century, the so-called standard view of science, which said that actually scientific theories are more like lost continents, or scientific laws are more like lost continents that you have to discover, and when you've discovered them, that's it. They downplayed the role of the observer, they downplayed the role of the scientific community in seeking to find laws with a big L, and when you discover that, then you almost knew the whole truth about that. And actually it was Lord Kelvin who famously said, right at the end of the 19th century, that in physics there's nothing much left new to discover, which I thought was a very interesting thing, coming just a few years before Einstein. So in the late 19th century you had a great confidence in the sense of having discovered the truth. You discovered these laws that were out there just waiting to be found. And I think whatever the weaknesses of a lot of the philosophy of science may have been during the 20th century, I think all scientists, if pressed, would accept that the status of scientific data is theory-laden, that we collect data through the lens provided by particular theories, and we acknowledge the fact that all our data reach us through these filters, not only provided the filters are provided by our prior sort of philosophical assumptions, but also via the processing effects of our instruments and our techniques and so forth. So I think scientists generally now are much more willing than they were a century ago to accept the inevitable human component of the scientific enterprise. So the question I really want to ask now is, how do they do that? How do they actually do that? What are the social practices of the scientific community that lead scientists to the idea that they are approaching something which is more true, if you like, as they do their work? Now, one phenomenon that you commonly find, I think, with sociologists of science is that they spend many years studying the practice of science, but often what they do is they base their study on one particular tiny subset of one particular scientific discipline. Then the sociologists publish their findings, they try and draw some rather general conclusions, only to find that the scientists just down the road actually working in a completely different discipline say that's not how they do things at all. And so I've often thought it must be very frustrating being a sociologist of science to try and make generalizations about the workings of the scientific community, because the different disciplines are just so different. And so the way of constructing a body of reliable knowledge does depend very much on the kind of discipline that you're in, and that's come up in the context of the history of science, and it's certainly the case today. And even what counts as a scientific explanation varies considerably between disciplines. Methods and techniques vary enormously. Some scientists never do any experiments. I mean, the whole of their lives they just sit in front of computers trying to guess how the universe works with the help of a bit of maths. You know, as a biologist, we don't really think that's science, but you know, one has to admit that's all part of the scientific enterprise. But you can accept, I think, all the different differences between the different scientific disciplines and still, I think, come up with some generalizations that we can all make as we look at the process whereby scientists claim that they are obtaining true information about the world. Now, the examples that I'm going to give in my own talk will be biased by my own lifetime spent in biomedical research, but I'd like to suggest that the principles of what I'm going to be saying apply to greater or lesser degrees right across the different scientific disciplines. And the particular practice that I want to focus on, first of all, is that of truth-telling in science. And that's something which might seem so obvious it's hardly worth mentioning, and yet as Roger Trigg was finishing up with this morning at the end of his talk, and I quote, "Science is in the business of discovering truth." And that, I think, opens up the way very nicely to this talk this afternoon as to how actually we do that. And this is a subject, in fact, that continues to occupy page after page of major scientific journals such as Nature and Science, albeit, as shown here, when truth-telling doesn't happen, as in the case of fraud, a topic that we'll come back to in just a moment. Historically, truth-telling has frequently been cited as an important element of the scientific revolution. As we were hearing yesterday from Peter, and indeed again this morning from Roger, the 17th century natural philosophers were very aware that in their promotion of the importance of the empirical method, they were overthrowing centuries of dependence upon the authority of the ancient Greek philosophers. They wanted to tell the truth about God's world. Now, we might think in retrospect they were slightly exaggerating the case, but many of them made a particular point in recording this. And now that Peter is actually just taking off to catch his flight to Australia, we sadly had to say goodbye to him, I shall now quote from Peter on this particular point, who says, "It was not the observation of animals and plants which counted, but whether all the relevant written sources had been consulted. Only gradually did it dawn on scholars that the empirical world might serve as a standard by which textual accounts of living things should be judged." So the natural world is the final arbiter, if you like, of what we count as truth in the scientific community. Now, Stephen Shapin, the American historian, has drawn attention to the way in which the early Royal Society, which we've already heard during this course, has the motto nullius in verba, take no one's word for it. The early Royal Society came to equate trustworthiness with gentlemanly origins. It tells you a lot about the social structure of the first part of the Royal Society, the early Royal Society in the middle of the 17th century. Now, of course, a gentleman was held at that time to tell the truth at all times. And therefore, someone as gentlemanly as Robert Boyle, we've heard about him, one of the founders of modern chemistry, they had a kind of head start in their ability to persuade others of the veracity of their experimental claims and their role as gentlemen in society. And when Boyle wrote his famous book, The Skeptical Chemist, or Chemist, he was careful to invoke witnesses of unimpeachable reputation to testify to what they had seen. And his experiments on mercury, which published in 1675, as he records, were witnessed by Henry Oldenburg and by the noble and judicious Lord Branker. Having a lord, you see, to witness your experiments gave them extra social validation. And so the skeptic in The Skeptical Chemist plays the role of the examining magistrate to determine whether the scientific claims made are true or false. So there's a very deep sense here in the early founders of modern science of this sense of the importance of truth. Now, of course, today, the role of gentlemen in establishing scientific facts may not be quite so prominent as before, but the centrality of truth and trustworthy witness to the truth lives on. In the context of contemporary scientific practice, the late Professor John Ziman comments that the acceptance of consistent, coherent, and plausible testimony from knowledgeable, disinterested witnesses is an essential feature of all practical reasoning. Knowing how to evaluate testimony is a basic requirement for membership of any culture. And in effect, academic science is a culture where a reputation for reliability, that is credibility, is the prime personal asset. And this is reflected very much in practice in the way that scientists tend to read the scientific literature. They're going to take much more notice of a publication from a lab that they respect for its kind of long-term credibility rating, and they're going to tend to ignore publications stemming from scientists who have a track record for getting things wrong. And I have to say, that's how I read the scientific literature. Some authors I won't even bother to read, because I just think, well, they got it wrong last time, so it's not even worth reading. So that's what we do. That's the way that we read the scientific literature. Now, of course, the scientific community has some very well-established practices for establishing and preserving the integrity of their data. And although these practices vary somewhat depending on the type of science, the principles are the same, and they can be illustrated by those practiced within my own UK Research Council-funded biological type of research community. Now, if you happen to be doing that kind of science here, you're very familiar with that, I must apologize the next couple of minutes, because I'm just going to work through things that you know very well already. But I think it's very important for the non-scientists here, philosophers and theologians and others, to be aware of what the social practice of truth-telling costs in terms of time, energy, and commitment. Okay, so how does it look? Let's take my institute down the road. what are the kind of social practices that we have. We have laboratory notebooks, they're dated, and experiments should be written up as soon after collecting the data as possible. All the important experimental details should be described, including any technical errors that took place during the experiment that might affect later interpretations. Primary data, wherever possible, should be attached or incorporated within the lab book in some way to provide a record that should be kept, in our case, for at least 10 years. Legally, it has to be kept for at least 10 years in a secure location. That means locked in a fireproof cabinet. Each page of the lab book should be signed off by the scientist line manager to confirm that the results have been properly recorded. And that's not least, actually, to secure against later patent disputes, if those might crop up at some later stage. So these lab books represent the historical records of witnesses to what was seen and measured. If you like, they're the modern equivalent of what Robert Boyle called the noble and judicious Lord Branca, except we have lab books. Now, the first critic then of the scientists' results is going to be their own supervisor. At regular intervals, they're going to pore over their recorded results together. They're going to be discussing, debating, and often disagreeing about their interpretations. And the scientist early on in their career who thought they'd obtained an interesting result is going to be very deflated as their supervisor points out that the fascinating extra band on the gel, or whatever it might be in your particular field, is merely an artifact arising from some rather obvious drawback in the technique or the way it was applied. And so often you get the PhD student in the first year who's going to be completely overwhelmed by the fact they've got to carry on repeating the same experiment till they get the same result, until some consistent pattern of results emerges. And certainly in the biological sciences, changes in parameters often have to be really big before people take them seriously. But that's not always the case. Sometimes very small differences can be important. And many years of research experience are necessary to make the judgment between over-skepticism and overconfidence in the reliability and significance of any sort of body of data. And even then, we can still get it wrong, being dismissive of a result that later turns out to be really important, or conversely, naively overinterpreting data that in fact could equally well receive a more trivial interpretation. And of course, quantification and statistical analysis are really important in assessing certain kinds of experiment, but to be quite honest, in the biological scientists will often look at a gel or something and say, well, that's a big difference, I accept that. Oh, no, that's pretty small. Okay, do it by eye. The statistics just come later to back up what you see with your eyes. That's the kind of science that we do. So a little bit different maybe from some other disciplines in some ways. Now, the next layer of criticism that the scientist faces occurs as they present their results not yet published to their peers in lab meetings, departmental seminars, and then, of course, with time, the wider scientific community out there in international meetings. And often that initial bubble of enthusiasm at the excitement of some new results is quickly popped by a colleague pointing out more mundane explanations for the same data. But equally, colleagues can make valuable suggestions about other techniques and approaches that would be worth trying. And so scientists are a rather curious kind of community. They help each other, they criticize each other. Sometimes they fight like dogs and cats, to establish their control of resources or priority over some discovery. In fact, I often think they're a bit like a family, really. It's a sort of community of people who work and fight together, and somehow some good results come out at the end. Then, of course, finally comes a day when the scientist submits a paper summarizing, not unusually, 3 or more years of work. And that paper, as we all know, represents just the tip of the iceberg. Most of the work accomplished represents repeated experiments or that never saw the light of day, or experiments that never worked, or blind alleyways that came to nothing. And then normally that paper will go out to 2 or 3 referees who act anonymously, and again the data and interpretations are subject to critical analysis. Referees, as all scientists in this room know very well, can be ruthless, they can be dismissive, they can be rude, and the more so if you've submitted your paper to one of the most prestigious journals. Now, in any research field, everyone knows which are the best journals and which aren't worth bothering about, and it's certainly more difficult to publish in the former than in the latter. The refereeing process itself, of course, is by no means perfect, but no one has yet managed to come up with a better system, so we'll kind of live with what we've got. Of course, scientists' papers can be refereed by their direct rivals, although many journals, not all, will exclude a limited number of people from refereeing the paper if you don't want them to. Sometimes they don't even take any notice of that either, as you find out afterwards. And then those referees' reports, again anonymously, are going to be returned to the scientist with a list of criticisms and suggestions for further experiments, sometimes involving maybe years, not months, but years more work before you can get it published. And of course, great groan goes around the lab when you get your referees' reports back, with lots of helpful suggestions about what to do next. But when the revised manuscript is sent in and accepted, all the effort will be seen to be worthwhile in retrospect. Now, more importantly, if the system has worked as it should, this long process of criticism and revision will have refined the experimental results and their presentation to the point at which only the best and most reliable data will see the light of day on the pages of a scientific journal. At least that's the idea of how it should work in an idealized world. Now, of course, even when the paper's been finally published, there's always the possibility that there might be some significant error of fact which is found later on in the results that might impact on the conclusions that have been drawn. And it's then the author's duty to publish a retraction in the same journal describing the error. And if you look at the back page of Nature, almost every issue has a little page of retractions or corrections on the back there doing exactly that. Now, the errors may be for perfectly valid reasons, sometimes beyond the control of the scientist involved, but still, publishing a retraction is deeply embarrassing for those involved. It takes moral commitment to do that, to practice that. But it's absolutely essential in maintaining a science as a body of trustworthy knowledge. So when we talk about truth-telling in science, it's not some impractical, vague ideal, but it's the daily goal, I would suggest, it's the daily goal of all working scientists, without which the scientific enterprise would simply collapse. No scientist begins their research project from ground zero, all are building on the labors of others stretching back over many years, decades, and indeed centuries. And it's this accumulation of reliable knowledge provided by faithful witnesses that enables science to keep proceeding at its tremendously breathless pace that we're in right now. Now, I would suggest no one with religious faith can fail to recognize that the practices encouraged by the scientific community to ensure truthful reporting of data are precisely those that are held up within their own religious communities. I do not mean at all to imply that atheists and agnostics are necessarily less committed in this respect. As a sociological fact, the values of the scientific community are shared in common by all scientists, at least in principle, irrespective of their personal beliefs. But as we've already noted, there is a particular historical resonance between the religious roots of science and its social practices. And so those like myself in the Christian tradition will be well aware of the way in which the importance of truth-telling is deeply ingrained within the biblical narratives. God is portrayed as a God of truth, who speaks truth, and Christians are called to reflect his character in their lives. Indeed, not telling lies is one of the 10 Commandments, as we've got up there on the screen, Leviticus 19 and verse 11. And then the Proverbs, also full of wonderful passages about truth. God delights in truthful accuracy. The Lord abhors, that means he hates dishonest scales, but accurate weights are his delight. Here we have a very practical God who wants people to be involved in telling the truth in practice. And closely integrated with the practice of truth in biblical thought is the idea of being a faithful witness. When Luke wrote his gospel, he was careful to point out that his record was based on eyewitness accounts, so that Theophilus might know the certainty of things that you have been taught. Luke chapter 1 and the first few verses. And the Apostle Paul constantly emphasized his role as a witness of what he had seen with his own eyes and the way in which his faith would actually collapse if that witness was false, and so on, deeply ingrained in the biblical narratives. And likewise, there are numerous passages in the Quran which emphasize the importance of truth-telling. For example, in the surah we've shown here, known as the cow, we have, and do not mix up the truth with the falsehood, nor hide the truth while you know it. In the surah of the Quran known as the cattle, we read, and he it is who has created the heavens and the earth with truth. And I'm sure there are perhaps others here from other faith traditions who can think about your own scriptures, and perhaps there are passages in there as well which highlight this huge undergirding and underpinning, if you like, of the moral practice of truth-telling. So I think it's very reasonable to suppose that scientists who have religious faith will be particularly committed to the idea of truth-telling. One hopes so. Using the Christian terminology provided by Jesus himself, they should act as salt and light in the world to help sustain a particular value system that is vital to the health of the scientific enterprise itself. And in this respect, at least, scientists share much with historians, at least with those historians who espouse a realist view of the value of historical research. As Richard Evans, Professor of Modern History here in Cambridge, has put it so well in his very robust critique, I have to say, of postmodernism entitled In Defense of History, it is not true to say that historians are not too concerned about discrete facts. On the contrary, whatever the criteria for the fact selection, the vast majority of the historian's efforts are devoted to ascertaining them and establishing them as firmly as possible in the light of historical evidence. Interpretations really can be tested and confirmed or falsified by an appeal to the evidence. And some of the time, at least, it really is possible to prove that one side is right and the other is wrong. So, as you can see, Professor Evans definitely not in the postmodernist tradition. And so, when you come back to science, there is a sense in which scientists play multiple roles as the creators, the recorders, and the interpreters of history, in a sense, only in their case, they act as their own recorders and writing down what happened at a certain time and place in a particular set of circumstances. And so, in the biological, biomedical, scientific context, the lab book is like a historical document that gives an account of what happened. Now, it is, of course, the account of one person or a group of particular individuals interpreting data within a particular interpretive framework. But if the dates in the lab book are false, or in other ways the records do not appear to match the accounts provided by other eyewitness accounts, then doubts may be cast upon the historical record. Now, how vital this is for the health of science is well illustrated by the huge concerns within the scientific community when cases of scientific fraud are uncovered. And I just want to illustrate this by a case that was also flagged up by John Bryant, one of our speakers from last week, and that's the case of Woo Suk Hwang from the Seoul National University in South Korea. And I pick on this example not at all because it's typical of science in that country. Fraud exists in the scientific community all around the world, in this country as in every other country, but simply because this case in particular has had a huge impact on the work of hundreds of scientists in many countries, and indeed a social and economic impact that goes much further than that. So what happened is that Hwang published a paper in Science in 2005, which reported the generation of 11 embryonic stem cell lines, which he claimed were derived from the skin cells of patients. And this involved the harvesting of human eggs from donors and the use of the DNA from the skin cells of the patients to fertilize the eggs from which the DNA has been removed in order to generate embryos genetically identical to the donor's DNA. This is the same procedure as we were thinking last week that was used to make Dolly the cloned sheep, but the goal in this case was to make the very early cloned human embryos from which the stem cell lines could then be established for use in medical research. Now, already back in 2004, Hwang had been accused of obtaining eggs by pressuring junior female members of the laboratory, but he'd actually come out publicly and denied that. And then later on last year, 2005, following publication of his science paper, Hwang began to send a number of corrections to Science concerning the data. And then meanwhile, on 19th of October 2005, South Korea's government launched what they called the World Stem Cell Hub, which was to be an international network for exchanging embryonic stem cell lines and cloning technology, and Huang was appointed to run it. So he was put right there in a very, very prestigious and highly public position. But then, by the end of 2005, the whole story began to unravel. First of all, Huang confessed that he had lied about the source of the eggs and that they had indeed come from junior members of the laboratory. One would expect being there under some pressure to do that. And by January of this year, it was proved definitively that the stem cell lines were in fact fakes and were not generated from the patients at all. In reality, there had been no generation of cloned human stem cells. And so Huang lost his job and is currently facing legal prosecution by the Korean government for fraud and misuse of government funds. For the government had put around $30 million into his work. So the personal stakes in such fraud cases are indeed very high indeed. Now, as I say, the scientific and more general social impact of this case has been huge. Some biomedical scientists changed research direction, and they went into stem cell cloning as a direct result of Huang's paper, and a previous paper as well, which was also fraudulent. This seemed to be such a breakthrough that it looked like being the pace setter for a whole new research field. In some cases, this involved scientists uprooting themselves and their families and going off to take up positions in another country or even another continent. Other scientists wasted huge amounts of time trying to reproduce Huang's results without success. And then during 2005, Korea's fledgling biotech industry, which had been doing really well, suddenly kind of collapsed in December when these fraudulent results were published. And even those Korean biotech companies that had nothing to do with that particular kind of research lost between a fifth and a half of their value due to the loss of investor confidence. So you see the huge fallout that comes from not telling the truth in science. And it would be easy to give dozens of other examples of fraud from scientific communities around the world, as I say, including this country. It just so happens this example is the most recent and the most dramatic. So we might ask, why does fraud happen? Reasons, I think, fairly obvious to everyone here. Huge pressure to publish, especially perhaps on younger researchers who are trying to develop their careers. But perhaps the particular pressure on Huang, who is, of course, already well established in his career, seems to have been these huge expectations placed on him to deliver certain results, to maintain leadership in this particular field. We've got also the desire for fame, prestige in the scientific community and beyond. There are financial rewards, certainly there, and perhaps psychologically by self-delusion or out of desperation. If the expected results aren't in by a certain date, then the paper won't be published, the grant proposal won't be written, the Korean science indeed might be finished. That's a lot of pressure. Scientists, especially in the earlier stages of their career, are under huge pressures to deliver, otherwise their career is likely to collapse. Now, how does fraud happen? I think it happens in a number of different ways. It can happen by a certain naivety on the part of the head of lab or co-author of papers. There were 26 authors on Huang's science paper. They were spread across several different countries. That's not uncommon in contemporary type of scientific papers. Most of them were not in a position to verify the results. There was no way they could have verified the results which were generated in the laboratory in Korea. So clearly more personal accountability by co-authors might have prevented the fraud in this case, not guaranteed. It can happen by lack of accurate record keeping with dates and full details recorded of experiments carried out. I myself once had the unhappy experience of chairing a committee set up to assess an accusation of scientific fraud. And one major lesson that came out of that affair was the importance of dating, recording, and storing primary data accurately. And without those essential historical records being in place, safely stored, then any investigator can lay themselves open to an accusation of fraud at some later date. Fraud can happen also practically by a lack of whistleblowers at the right moment. And by whistleblowers, we mean those colleagues, those people in the lab roundabout who notice something funny is going on and who go to the person or go to the head of lab and tell them about it. Now, people who police their own communities, as we all know, are often the most zealous lawkeepers and whistleblowers, and generally they're going to be the same people around in that environment in the same lab. As Edmund Burke has said, it is necessary only for the good man to do nothing for evil to flourish. And that's very much the case in the scientific community. And every scientist, I would suggest, has a moral responsibility to expose fraud if they are thinking that's the direction things are going. By lack of careful refereeing of the paper, I think there are particular dangers involved when the results described are very exciting or unexpected, they're not fitting in with the current paradigm of a particular research field, and editors of journals have a great responsibility here because they're naturally eager to be the first to publish such material, but equally any referee worth their salt must exert a higher degree of skepticism about very unexpected findings. But I have to say, there's one who referees a lot of papers, this is easier to actually say than to practice. And as the editor of Nature has remarked in the quote up there on the screen, in the context of the Huang case, usually reviewers have to take on faith that the authors are presenting what they say they are. And that's absolutely correct. There's no way that the referee can ascertain the truth of all the data presented, although of course they can look for kind of danger signals, and referees get fairly good at doing that. But that little phrase, I think, on faith, is an interesting one for the editor of Nature to use, again highlighting the way in which the values of truth-telling and trust are embedded in scientific practice. We really are enormously dependent on the moral qualities and practices of others within the scientific community. If they fail, then it has a negative impact on us all. In the scientific community, we are our brother's keeper, if you want to quote from the early part of Genesis. Now, should the fact of fraud within the scientific community make us trust scientific knowledge less in general? Now, I would say, funnily enough, probably not. For a start, fraud, thankfully, remains relatively rare. Now, of course, it's very unlikely that every fraudster is exposed. But even if we doubled the number of fraudsters and doubled the number of fraudulent papers published, these would still remain a tiny proportion of scientific publications as a whole. And the huge outcry in the scientific community when cases of fraud are exposed is certainly an indication of how seriously this business of truth-telling is maintained, as I've just been mentioning. But it's also a great strength, I think, of science that it is a self-correcting process. Fraudulent papers, as well as the papers that may be wrong for quite innocent reasons, are gradually sort of weeded out by normal scientific practice. And this self-correcting process of science is somewhat analogous to the process of natural selection. As scientists try building on the published work of others as a basis for their research program, and then eventually their experiments fail to turn out as they expected, they eventually find out, sometimes very painfully, that the other lab's results are just plain wrong. And so there is a continuous natural selection process going on in science whereby the best theories and the best data are constantly being tested by the scientific programs of other sections of the scientific community, and only the best eventually survive. And meanwhile, the inaccurate data or the poor theories are simply just left to lie by neglect in the scientific literature, and eventually they will be forgotten and people will pass on. And so just as the precise process whereby genetic variation is generated is really irrelevant to the process of the natural selection of genotypes involving the testing criterion of reproductive success, so by analogy, downright fraudulent papers, as well as papers that are wrong for non-fraudulent reasons, will, I think, eventually be weeded out by the winnowing work of many scientists, although that process sometimes will take a long time. And so to complete the analogy, the papers that survive with flying colours will prove to be the most fruitfully reproductive for the future of a particular research field, and in turn will trigger off a whole array of new research programs. Now, we spent quite a long time on how in practice the scientific community tries to generate this reliable body of constructed knowledge. And I've suggested that the moral practices of the scientific community didn't just come from nowhere, but in reality they've been nurtured, they've been shaped by this theological matrix within which modern science has been incubated, as we've been hearing over the past day or so. Now, I want to spend the rest of my time in considering three other characteristics of scientific practice that scientists believe are important in helping them to provide satisfactory scientific explanations for things. And I think it's interesting to reflect in each case, in each one of these three further examples, on the parallels that one observes between the quest for accurate scientific knowledge on the one hand and accurate religious knowledge on the other, which we'll be coming back to later on this afternoon. Now, coherence is often looked to as one of the hallmarks of reliability in science, just as it is in faith. In science, Darwin's theory of evolution has often been taken as an example of the way in which a novel theory can bring coherence to a wide range of facts that otherwise remain incoherent. So the late biologist Ernst Mayr, who has written The Theory of Evolution, is quite rightly called the greatest unifying theory in biology. The diversity of organisms, similarities and differences between kinds of organisms, patterns of distribution and behavior, adaptation and interaction, all this was merely a bewildering chaos of facts until given meaning by the evolutionary theory. And so Darwin's goal then in The Origin of Species, which he referred to as one long argument, was to kind of draw together an immense array of varied evidence that only made sense if the theory of natural selection was correct. Much of this evidence was actually already known previously, and so it was Darwin's brilliance to see the same evidence in a new light in support of a novel theory. And scientific theories have often been compared to maps that help to join up many pieces of data to render them coherent, to make a joined up narrative, looking at data from one particular perspective that may well be complementary to another perspective. So you need a lot of maps to do justice to the reality that's around us. And science often advances not by throwing away the old map completely, but by modifying the map in order to incorporate new data. Now, scientists who have gained new insights into the properties of matter have often remarked how they were attracted to the new theory by its elegance and ability to explain a broader array of phenomena than previous theories. Dirac and Schrödinger, two of the founders of quantum theory, remarked that it was a sort of act of faith with us that any equations which describe fundamental laws of nature must have great mathematical beauty in them. It was a very profitable religion to hold and can be considered as the basis of much of our success. A couple of months ago I was attending in Vienna the centenary conference of the mathematician Gödel, and the quotation that I heard more than any other was this one, which we've already heard, I think, during the past few days, from Eugene Wigner, the Physics Nobel Prize winner, who once remarked that the miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics, is a wonderful gift that we neither understand nor deserve. And so this unexpected coherence seems built into the fabric of the universe. Now, Einstein was, of course, famous for not being at all impressed by the experimental confirmations of his theory, once remarking that I do not by any means find the chief significance of the general theory of relativity in the fact that it predicted a few minute observable facts, but rather in the simplicity of its foundation and in its logical consistency. And so perhaps far more so in mathematical physics, certainly, than in my own field of biology, the big theories are favoured for their elegance, for their internal consistency, and for their fit with the equations. I think it was the Soviet physicist Lev Landau who once remarked that cosmologists are often in error but never in doubt. Now, that's, of course, a joke which biologists like to tell. Now, the holder of a rationally grounded faith would want to say, I think, that the quest for coherence is as central to the religious quest as it is for the scientific enterprise, and I know that we're going to be hearing more about that from Roger Trigg later on today. Okay, so the second point of this last three that I want to flag up is this one we've heard mentioned already, that of refutation or falsifiability, another key aspect to the scientific enterprise. The 20th century philosopher of science, Kuhn, that Roger was mentioning this morning, famously made the ability to obtain falsifying counter-evidence in principle as that key demarcation line that separates science from non-science. And in normal, everyday science, refuting evidence does indeed play a key role in many research fields. In my own field of biomedical research, again, if the band on the gel isn't in the right place where your hypothesis predicted that it should be, well, tough, so much the worse for your hypothesis. So we use Popperian falsifiability every day in the lab. It's actually what goes on. But in the big theories of science, life becomes much more complicated. There are plenty of examples from the history of science when scientists didn't give up on their pet theories when refuting evidence was found. And Darwin was pretty worried in the 19th century as Lord Kelvin kept revising downward the age of the Earth, as eventually its reduced age did not seem to be long enough to accommodate a process of evolution by natural selection. But Darwin didn't give up on evolution. Instead, in fact, he made later editions of The Origin of Species more Lamarckian. The inheritance of acquired characteristics is a useful mechanism for speeding up evolution. And as it turned out, Kelvin was wrong and Darwin was right. That is to say about evolution, not about Lamarckianism. But whether to give up a theory due to evidence that counts against it is much easier to assess with the advantage of hindsight. And in general, big theories in science tend to be remarkably resilient to counter-evidence. They explain so much, so well, that anomalies are often just put on the back burner, as it were, to address sometime later. And you need a huge amount of refuting data, or at least one major item is needed before you can get a really big theory to crash to the ground. But, as I say, in everyday science, the sort of stuff that we do in biology, most scientists are actually faithful Popperians, if you like, even though, as I say, they may never have heard of Popper because, they never did get round to reading any of the philosophy of science. So in my sort of work, it's quite possible to have an idea, probably in the bath, in a relaxed state on Sunday evening, and to put in practice from Monday to Thursday and, have a result by Friday. You can actually do that kind of science. You can prove that your idea in the bath on Sunday night is definitely wrong. Popperian science works. You can exclude wrong theories, but it's all a little bit on a small scale type of theory. Now, refutation clearly contributes significantly to the reliability of scientific knowledge for the simple reason you can exclude things that aren't true, and that's its whole purpose. Now, again, I think we can find some interesting resonances here with the assessment of religious claims, particularly with perhaps the three great monotheistic religions, the Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that are much more dependent, of course, than other religions are on the historical basis for their beliefs. In other words, as scientists who wish to investigate religious beliefs, we don't have to suddenly press a little switch in our brain that converts our brains from a sort of objective, rational mode to subjective, irrational mode. In reality, there are data that can count for or against religious beliefs, perhaps particularly historical data, though certainly other kinds of data as well. And my purpose here is not to try and assess any of those kind of beliefs, but to counter this common misconception that somehow science and religion live at opposite poles. There you've got science as objective, it's rational, it's clinical. We were thinking about universality this morning, whereas religion is subjective, emotional, personal, and unprovable. What I observe in practice is that scientists who've come to religious faith will frequently comment how similar has been their way of thinking as they have come to faith with their way of thinking as scientists. Not identical, of course, but with some significant similarities. And this brings us to the third and final scientific practice that I want to highlight as we think about how the scientific community thinks that it's generating true beliefs, and that is the characteristic of reproducibility. Now, those who've tended to criticize Popper have pointed out that in practice, scientists do not always drop their theories once counter-evidence begins to accumulate, but instead they depend more on the affirmation of theories by their repeated testing in different laboratories. But refutation and reproducibility should be taken, I think, as different sides of the same coin. One or the other may be of more relevance depending on the scientific question being addressed, but generally both are critically important in establishing or otherwise of scientific theories. It's especially powerful when a theory makes a prediction of what ought to be the case, sometimes on quite theoretical grounds, and this is then confirmed by later experimental findings and repeated, confirmed experimentally not just once but many times. And I think Einstein's relativity gives a very good example of that. It took the best part of half a century before his great theory was adequately tested and confirmed. So scientists have this special privilege of coming to believe in something that no one else in the world, to the best of their knowledge, yet knows or yet believes, for the simple reason they've just discovered it and nobody else knows about it. Now, as well as being a privilege, that is a huge, serious responsibility. Well, first of all, you've got to scan the latest literature in case someone else has the same result. Conferences are attended with a feeling of some foreboding in case someone stands up and announces your discovery. But once the scientist's discovery has been published, the results are worrying for quite a different reason. Since they're so novel, what happens if nobody else can repeat them? What happens if your facts are right, but your interpretation is wrong? And so it's enormously reassuring when the results are repeated and indeed extended by many other laboratories around the world. For I think that nothing reflects the gracious faithfulness of God in his created order so much as the reproducibility of the world we observe. As we were thinking about this morning, if the same experiment is repeated under exactly the same conditions in any part of the world, then the same results will be obtained, irrespective of language, of culture, of race, or of religion. And not only does this fact help to underpin the reliability of scientific knowledge, but it also helps to explain why scientists tend not to take very seriously the postmodernist suspicion of meta-narratives, with their attempt to replace them with fragmented realities constructed by different communities or even individuals, with each community immersed in its own language game that Roger was telling us about. That is not the experience of scientists who travel to international conferences and find that the universe itself appears to have its own meta-narrative, one written in the language of mathematics, giving rise to properties that are reproducibly accessible to all people, irrespective of their background or culture. So you'll see that I'm not at all sympathetic to the idea of a Christian science or an Islamic science or a Buddhist science or any other kind of label, but simply to one particular scientific community with its own particular agreed practices all around the world. Now, I thought I would close with a quotation from a leading figure in the scientific community. This is Francis Collins. He was once a very convinced atheist, as you may know. In his in the late 20s, he became a Christian, and he explains actually how he took this, for him, very radical step in this book that has just come out, The Language of God, by Francis Collins. I'd vowed over this past weekend that I would have a rest from science and religion, having been right through Unit 1. This book arrived on Saturday morning. I've nearly read it over the weekend. So it is a good read. It's an easy read. We're trying to get some on the books table by the end of this week. I don't know if we'll succeed, but it's a nice read. But it was Collins who, you may know, brought to completion the Human Genome Project, which was instigated by Jim Watson. He took over from Jim Watson back in the early 90s, and he still heads up the National Human Genome Institute in Washington. I've chosen this particular quote from Collins because I think it illustrates very well in which this actual practice of science that we've been thinking about resonates with religious faith. So Collins says, the work of a scientist involved in this project, particularly a scientist who has the joy also of being a Christian, is a work of discovery, which can also be a form of worship. As a scientist, one of the most exhilarating experiences is to learn something that no human has understood before. To have a chance to see the glory of creation, the intricacy of it, the beauty of it, is really an experience not to be matched. And scientists who do not have a personal faith in God also undoubtedly experience the exhilaration of discovery. But to have that joy of discovery mixed together with the joy of worship is truly a powerful moment for a Christian who is also a scientist. So I'll let Francis Collins have the last word. Thank you.
Denis, thank you very much. Those of us who are scientists certainly recognise many things in the description of what goes on in the lab. Yeah, let's have some questions.
You mentioned Darwin and Popper in the same context, so I should ask the question. I think, as I remember, Popper gave lesson about Darwinism in Oxford once, and was interested in the theory. And he took that it resembled to his theory because there was trying and errors are selected, and so it was looking like his theory, which was defending refutation of the wrong theories, and so he had sympathy to the theory of Darwin. But although he had that sympathy, he thought that Darwin's theory was irrefutable and it cannot fulfill the scientific standards which was pulled with by Popper. And so it is why he called in his article Darwinism as a metaphysical research program. He only claimed that it can be only a metaphysical research program. And it is so established in a plastic way, it's impossible to refute it, and it cannot fulfill of his philosophy of science standards, and it cannot be scientific in that sense for Popper. And I think Popper is in many sense true. For example, according to Popperian theory, when we think, for example, let's say in an island, we have a frog, for example, a few bacteria, let's say a chicken, for example. We cannot say what will happen after 1,000 years or 100 years or 1 million years after, because we are in a lack of a mathematical definition. In fact, we can only have for the future, our assumptions can only when we put the facts together with mathematical formula, we can have some predictions for future. But with that predictions, it can be understood if this theory is true or not, and in that sense, that theory can be refutable. But Darwin's theory doesn't have any such mathematical laws. Although I think there was some Cobb's law or some other laws in that sense, but I think today mostly Darwinists don't accept it. They think that is some part of orthogenesis. So we cannot make predictions for future if in that island we find some animals, because we have in a lack of mathematical formula. We cannot have predictions for the back. We cannot say before 1,000 years what there was in that island from looking at that frog or chicken or bacteria. So we cannot have predictions. We are what always doing is only to imply some situational logic in the. We are finding data, and after finding data, we are all putting that data according to that theory, which we are a priori thinking that is true in fact. So it is why its theory is irrefutable according to Popper, and it said that it cannot be scientific in that sense.
Okay, so let's just go back to Popper. Actually, Popper famously wrote a letter to the New Scientist, which they published, making exactly the point that was mentioned, and so on. He actually retracted, I have to say that he retracted that letter later on. So he did present your view, you're absolutely correct. He did actually retract that view, and as people kind of explained to him that there is quite a lot of data you can use to falsify Darwinian evolution. So that would then bring me to my second point: is Darwinian evolution falsifiable? I mean, in the first instance, it is an inference to the best explanation about historical data, as many of the scientists are. Of course, the science of geology is as well. Having said that, there's plenty of things that would falsify Darwinian evolution in its neo-Darwinian contemporary sense. And I'll give you, just a few examples. So, for example, we now have about 200 genomes. We've sequenced 200 genomes of different organisms around the world, and it's completely apparent from that that they do fit very nicely. So it's a very nice fit with supporting that Darwinian evolution must be the case. But by the same token, it could have been otherwise. Those genomes, for example, could have been so different. They could have been so unrelated. The genes used in different organisms could have been so different that it would have been difficult to sustain a Darwinian mechanism. So that's one kind of example. The other kind of example would be that you would never find, let's say, intermediate forms, between different species. But those sort of intermediate forms a lot have been discovered in the past year or so, including that wonderful creature called a tiktaalik from North Canada that has little, 4 legs and is a sort of intermediate between aquatic animals and between those as it were, crawling out onto land. And it's got actually elbows. It's like a fish that can do press-ups. I think one of the people described it from the research group who discovered that. It came out in Nature a few months ago, and so on and so on. I mean, these are sort of being published in Science and Nature and so forth every month or so. So that would be another prediction one can make from Darwinian evolution. You could refute it by simply if you could never ever find any of those ever, then you could get worried, definitely, and so on. I can go on about that. I mean, the universality of the genetic code, I suppose, would be another one. Had we found that there were 3 different genetic codes and they were all very distinctly different, then common descent would have been, I think, difficult to sustain if that had been the case. So, one could give many, many examples of that, I think, so, of refutation.
I think the onus is on me to make a comment. Francis Collins, The Language of God, that's the comment he made on the White House lawn in 2000 after the announcement of the draft of the human genome.
Can you speak up a little bit loud?
Yeah, can you hear
It's
me?
hard to hear it.
The Language of God was the comment Francis Collins made about the human genome draft in 2000 on the White House lawn with Bill Clinton. That's a statement of faith. It's not a statement he would make in the scientific literature because it's not a scientifically proven statement. So in the public domain, that is potentially misleading. It's misleading scientifically. So I would say in the public domain there is the potential there for what you might want to call untruth. As an atheist I would, you would disagree. So you have to be careful in the public domain that you don't make conclusions that are not scientific, because that could lead the public to think something scientific when it's not. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yes. I don't know if you heard that. The point being made here is that in The Language of God, the title of this book by Francis Collins, there's a danger that we give the impression to the public that something is a sort of scientific claim when actually it's a religious claim. I think that's what you were saying, yes. I think that is true, yes. I think that, having read now 3/4 of the book anyway, I can say that I think Francis Collins would be very aware of that. And he specifically says that he's speaking, if you like, as from his own personal faith point of view in this particular book. It's actually an account of how he came to faith, that kind of thing, why, what the justification for his own beliefs, and so forth, and a bit of that kind of thing. So it's a bit like, people always say, of course, this is from the physics and cosmology community. If you want to sell a book, put, God in the title. For a while, there was a lot of books coming out on cosmology, and they all seem to have God in the title, irrespective of whether the person cared a bit about God. It just seemed to sell the book. So one can get a bit cynical on that. But in the case of Collins, I think it is actually out of his own personal conviction, and so it's a personal account.
Yes.
He's not writing a paper for Nature. You
Okay,
couldn't
the
do
book
that for
is,
Nature.
but the statement on
Yeah.
the White House lawn was made to a nation, most of which probably won't read that book. That's my point.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a fair point. Yeah.
Well, thanks for the wonderful presentation. As for Darwin and Popper and the falsifiability thing, actually Darwin himself put a criterion for falsifiability in his book. If any organ, he said, if it can be demonstrated that any organ could not have been formed by successive, slight modifications, my theory would break down. So I think he put a criteria. But I think nowadays it's interesting that that criteria doesn't work, because some scientists are arguing that some organs are actually not easy to explain by successive modifications. This might be the famous bacterioflagellum, or the avian lung, which is just in the which is a totally different structure from the other types of lungs. And now the reply becomes, well, we haven't discovered the explanation for those organs yet. But if we haven't discovered the Darwinian explanation for such organs yet, how do we know that they exist in the first place? So I think Darwinian evolution was a falsifiable theory when Darwin put it, but now for maybe some cultural reasons it became to an unfalsifiable position, because no other theory, especially the theory of design, is not given any chance in the first place.
Okay, so I think, there are two sides to the kind of job that theories are doing. I mean, one reason for having theories is they explain a lot of data that we have already in our hands. So that's the function of theories. They're to draw together all these various bits of data and make a model or a map that would make sense of it. So I think the first thing to remember is that the power of a theory lies in what it explains already, the data that we already have. So for us as working scientists, I don't work on Darwin and evolution like most biochemists don't. We actually work on something quite different, but we use Darwinian evolution as a kind of workhorse, you could say, as a working theory that you're using every day in the lab. And you carry on using theories because they work. You have a utilitarian view of theories. They do work for you, actual work in the lab. They make predictions. So when you put your genetic sequence in the database, it's going to pull out lots of homologies, from different organisms all around the world. And that's what you expect from Darwin and evolution being the case. So you carry on using it because it makes sense of the data you already have. So now we come to the question of making predictions about what it will do in the future. Now, in a sense, you're always going to have a receding future, in one sense, because if thinking about putting together complete evolutionary sequence pathways for every single biochemical pathway and every single entity, biological entity, that is a huge, huge task, okay? So, and that's going to go on for a very, very long time. In a sense, we're at the beginning of that process and not at the end. So then you say, well, how do we know that we're ever going to be able to do that? What would give us some justification in thinking that that process will eventually be accomplished? And I would say because, if you're going in an old car, to London, and it gets you to London, you do well, you think it'll also get you a bit further. If something's successful a little bit of the way, it's going to get you further. If your kind of explanations, your kind of approach does a good job on certain things, it's a reasonable supposition it'll get you the rest of the way as well. Okay. So, in other words, when we now look at a lot of biochemical pathways, including a lot of entities inside the cell and so forth, I mean, what we understand about the evolutionary past now compared to 10 years ago is huge. It's absolutely huge because we have genomics, we can look up those genes, we can see what function they have in other organisms, we begin to map out, how those things came together by gene duplication, by modification of genes, there's lots of processes. So, I mean, if you take Darwin's black box by Behe, just to take one example, and the kind of examples he was giving, and that was 1996, many of them now, we have hugely greater understanding, and including the immune system, I have to say. In my own field, we know a lot more about the evolution of the immune system now. Do we know everything? Definitely not. Do we have a complete evolutionary pathways for every component of the immune system? Definitely not. But when you look at the progress that's being made, I think there's a very reasonable assumption to be made that, give us a bit more time, and we're going to have a lot more genomes coming out in the next few decades. And we're just going to understand it a lot more than we are now. So I think I would be very, very hesitant, just based on the fact of our present ignorance about certain biological entities, to say, we're not going to find out how those came into being quite soon, actually. So I think that's the way that research programs, last week we were thinking about Latikos and research programs. I mean, that's how they develop and carry forward, because if they're very successful in one area, they keep sort of moving forward, If they came to a stop, if now 2006 suddenly, we just weren't getting anywhere with this theory, it wasn't getting us any further, that would be different. That would be different. If it was really not being very fruitful, then we would be tempted to give it up and get a better theory. But this theory is really, it's moving at a very, very fast pace. So that's the point I would want to make there, Hank. So,
Thanks. In light of many business scandals and such across the U.S., many business schools are requiring now ethics courses as part of the training in economics or an MBA or sort of. Do you have any sympathy at all for requiring or encouraging ethics training among scientists?
No, that's a very good question. It's a question about getting ethics courses going and getting scientists in particular, those training to be scientists, into ethics courses. I think that would be very, very valuable. And a great lack, actually, we have in our school system here in this country, although we have religious education in the state system, what we don't often have is philosophy and helping people to know how to think. It's a great lack. I mean, it's coming in more now into some schools, but even just the whole way of actually having to think about what you're doing, what kind of data you're collecting and so on. It would be very helpful to have people not only trained in ethics but also in philosophy as well. So I would be very, very supportive of that kind of thing. Now, in my own institute, we do address that. Of course, nearly every research institute or university has an ethical committee when it comes to actually doing experiments that involves obviously animals or human beings. It has to go through all kinds of ethical committees before you can have permission to carry out those kind of experiments. So I mean, there's a lot of ethical discussion goes on in the context of the scientific community itself. So there's a lot of policing of the ethical things that go on. And almost every research place would be set up with committees or protocols for what happens if there's fraud, or people have to know about that, what to do if they think they've discovered fraudulent data, where do they go, what do they do. In our place, people are told what to do ahead of time. They have to know that. So there's a certain amount of practical ethical training in that case. But
I think when some sociologists or philosophers of science who, when they challenge the reliability of science as they challenge that science is a reliable guide to truth, I think what they are saying is not that the scientists are not honest. I think perhaps most of them can grant that scientists are honest, or the fact that the entire scientific community can constitutes a healthy check and balance to ensure that honesty. But they still think that they still have reason to be skeptical about whether science is a reliable guide to truth, because they think that we have difficulty justifying the fact that induction is a reliable method of getting at the truth, and there's problem justifying that inference to the best explanations is a reliable guide to the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one has to say, I mean, I think it would be extraordinarily healthy and helpful if, philosophers could come and spend a month in a lab, and actually just sit through lab meetings and listen to how people handle data and how they argue about it and that kind of thing. I think the disciplines are far too separate. And I think that's a great pity, actually. And maybe it should be compulsory, just as it should be compulsory for scientists, let's say, to go on an ethics course. It should be compulsory for philosophers, to spend some weeks maybe in some lab somewhere, just to see, especially if they're working on science itself, to see how it actually works out in practice. And I think what they would find is a huge passion and commitment to truth, actually. I mean, it's not that scientists are going to say that every day, but actually when you look at their social practices, that's what they're doing. And I'm really amazed sometimes. In our lab, we have weekly lab meetings, or we did until recently when I went part-time. So we had 2 lab meetings every week, and we sit around the table and people present results, and everyone else criticizes, and you don't believe that rubbish, and this is going on all the time, So I think this sort of process of criticism and open discussion is just characterize, a lot of what's going on. That's all going on way down here at the beginning, not when you get to your paper in Nature. That's way down the road, years ahead. But it's this sort of interaction going on at a very local, human level, I think, which does help to. I think philosophers should come and watch that process, how it works.
My point is that this is not what the philosophers or sociologists challenge. They don't challenge this, they accept this.
Yes,
they accept
okay.
that scientists are honest, or that the entire scientific community can become a check and balance to ensure that honesty. What they challenge is that they think that we don't have any way to justify the basic assumptions of science, which is the basic assumptions of the methodology of science, which is induction, and whether that inference to the best explanations is a reliable guide to the truth. Yeah, I think.
Well, in that case, they should come to talks by Professor Trigg, for example. I mean, they shouldn't come to the scientists, because the scientists probably won't be able to explain that to them. I mean, the scientist usually is not going to be able to explain why what they're doing is actually justified, why ultimately that's and they have to come to the philosophers, they have to come to people with religious commitments to find out why that should be the case. But generally speaking, they're pragmatists, as Roger was saying this morning. They don't think about those things. They're busy with developing their careers. They just want to get their results, get the papers out, and that's the way it goes. But those people doing that in the process are taking part in this community which is very committed to truth-telling. I think that's the interesting part. So they're actually practicing very much moral practices. They're engaging in an ethical enterprise, maybe sometimes not always with knowing about it. So, but I take that point. Yeah.
Did we have a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that was quite helpful to be reminded of the reliability of the experimental wing of science. It's helpful, and I think, that you have a page which is devoted to work that I've been a little more familiar with lately, namely more theoretical sorts of physics. It seems to me that some of these quotations from these 20th century luminaries are rather damning. Take Einstein, for example, replace general relativity with string theory, and you get the sort of ideology that people like George Ellis were inveighing against last week, or some other people one can see in some of the high-energy physics preprint literature. I'm having trouble pulling up some of the names at the moment. It seems like in this sort of theoretical physics, there's a lot more room for the underdetermination of theories by data. That's part of what Duhem had in mind in talking about that. So I guess I wonder, insofar as, to the extent that theology tends to interact with these more rarefied theoretical sorts of sciences, rather than your much more experimental, biological, sciences, about how things work every day. I wonder if maybe we're going to form an overestimate of the relevant parts of science.
Yeah, I think I know where your question is going. I think there's a lot of truth in that, and I think one of the problems that one has in the science-religion debate, in a sense, it's always going to be a little bit biased towards those particular disciplines in science that currently, for whatever reason, may appear to be raising the more religious type of questions. And so, for example, in this course, we don't have a lecture about, let's say, the relationship between chemistry and religion. It doesn't usually crop up. Inorganic chemists usually don't have a lot to say in this area, particularly, because it simply doesn't seem to raise particular religious kind of questions, whereas if we go to cosmology, if we go to biology, first two questions were biological, then usually that seems to raise more questions. So in a sense, the discussion is always going to be a little bit biased by what are the current interactions that are going on. But I think it's interesting to look back in the history of science. That wasn't always the case. There were other kinds of questions going on in the 17th century and then the 18th century. So it depends on what era one's in as to exactly what kind of interchange there's going to be. But I think you were implying there's a kind of bias in the discussion by, let's say, these people who go for elegance and coherence being highlighted because it has sort of certain religious resonances. Is that
right?
I think partly what you're saying.
I wouldn't want the reliability of what goes on in your lab to be uncritically applied to the reliability of some philosophers' aesthetic intuitions, or some physicists' aesthetic intuitions.
That's right, yes. I think what is remarkable, though, is how, in the case of Einstein, I don't know if his tongue was a little bit in the cheek when he was, saying that particular quote that I gave, but I think, clearly he was hugely committed to the more theoretical, mathematical aspects. But I think, the question is still open. Are they verifiable in principle? Are they refutable in principle? Are there experiments that we could possibly imagine, that could test them? Now, I think even in the time of Einstein, there clearly were people who said, well, wow, if only we could do that. They were already beginning to imagine, even as a thought experiment, the kind of experiments that could be done. Now, my impression from string theory is that's not the case. That actually, people here can correct me, it's not my field, but you can't even imagine what kind of data is going to be able to test between the many different versions of string theory. So it seems to me that's quite important. You know, they're both theoretical constructs, but one, in principle, you can imagine ways in which it could be tested. And in a way, we're coming back to Roger's point about A.J. Ayer and, you know, whether there is at the other side of the moon. We haven't seen it yet, you know. Well, in principle, yeah, you can have a rocket that goes around and has a look, you know. Doesn't require very much imagination to think of the right experiment. So I think that comes into it as well.
I just wanted to follow up briefly on this idea that philosophers should spend time in the lab with scientists. I think sociologists of science certainly have done that. There's a particular brand of sociologists that could be called anthropologists of science, in particular Bruno Latour, who spent quite some time in a lab and concluded that the function of laboratories was to move pieces of paper around. But I didn't want to dwell on that point, so I just thought I'd ask you about what you have to say about the authority of science, perhaps compared with the authority of religion. It's I think it's a common view in our society in general that because science is this rational pursuit of reliable knowledge about nature, it should have authority to make claims about nature or to prescribe certain behaviours or something like that. I was wondering if you had a comment on that.
Yes, I think one always has to be very cautious about the word authority, especially if we're living in an open society or indeed in any society, as to what one means by that. I think I would take the view that science does have a role, if you like, in authority as applying to particular things within its domain. Now, obviously, the tendency is for anyone who becomes successful or has a high public profile in any field is to start making comments, sometimes authoritative comments, about all kinds of things about which they know nothing. And so I think this is the tension in which anybody lives in, whether it be philosophers or scientists or anybody else. So I think scientists should be looked to as a body of reliable knowledge, they also have to be very honest about when they don't know. And the problem about the relationship between government and science, which often comes up, is that government wants to have absolute answers. They come to the scientists, you know, well, will this virus cause a pandemic or not, for example? And the scientist kind of goes back, you know, and thinks about it a little bit and says, well, probably not, but we're not sure, you know, but, you know, there's a 5% chance it might, but probably not, kind of thing. But the government never likes that. You know, they want to interpret that in a much more authoritative way to reassure a worried public and come out with something that is actually much more certain than the science can allow. So I think what you have in the public sort of sphere of science is this process going on whereby scientists often may be very cautious, actually, and say, well, as far as we know, we can say this. You know, the data allows that. You know, that's what we try and do. But then that package is taken and reprocessed for public consumption. And I think often that can be a problem. But you can also have the problem, as we all know, where scientists will, as I say, stand up in front of a camera or on a TV program and start making claims about all kinds of things that clearly they know nothing about at all. And that can be very embarrassing for the rest of us in the scientific community, but unfortunately it does happen. So that's...
I think it was Irving Langmuir who wrote about what he called pathological science. Examples would be the supposed discovery of polywater or cold fusion, where whole research programs were generated on what now appears to have been very dubious grounds, possibly self-delusion rather than fraud. Have any comments on the relevance of this to what you've been saying?
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, there's obviously a huge area of what people now might want to call rather rudely pseudoscience. But I think it's true, and every now and again, these are always going to happen, these cases, and I'm sure they'll happen in the future, because, you know, one really wants an exceptional discovery, and sometimes people think they really have the data to support that, and indeed, maybe the data doesn't look too bad, you know, and it's only when it's really looked at very closely by other scientists, when, you know, you try reproducibility and so forth, cold fusion, you know, then the whole thing begins to collapse. But I think there is a wishful thinking. You know, people, it's a human, as I said, I mean, I think the scientific community is a very human community, and you do find self-delusion going on quite a bit, actually. But I think the the training of PhD students is partly to try and train them out of self-delusion. That should be part of what PhD training is all about, to try and train skeptics. So what I try and do in my lab is try and train skeptics, people who don't believe the data. But sometimes you get the other problem, and sometimes you have to play the role, I think, of head of lab as a referee. In a sense, I'm talking about a football referee here, but so in other words, you have some people who are far too easily believing their own data and tend to overinterpret it. But perhaps an equal problem, actually, especially in Britain, because it's a personality trait, is you get people who never believe their data at all. Okay, and that's this sort of humble, super humble approach, and so you're constantly either trying to criticize one person because they're over-interpreting their data, or criticizing the other person because they don't believe the data. And so you have to have, different social role, actually, I think, in running a lab, because you have people with different personalities and backgrounds, and that comes into it as well.
Should we take one last question, then we'll break and see?
Just a quick question, actually. It's about one of your opening statements that scientists are critical realists.
Yes.
And just wondering if is that just sort of based on your own observances in your laboratory, or is that a general comment, or based on statistics, or on?
Right. Yeah. I have no statistical data to support my claim. Okay, that's a very reasonable point. I think it's simply by being around in the scientific community and watching what people do and what they think about their data. And then when you go to the bar at the end of a hard day's work at a conference, you have a talk with people, and sometimes it does sometimes get onto philosophy, actually, and pretty much you find that this is where people are at, even though they may not call themselves that. Basically they just wouldn't bother. If they didn't think they were finding out something which was actually real and true at the end of the day, they really wouldn't bother to do it. So there is a sort of driving force there underneath, I think. So, but it's certainly not based on any solid sociological data. Maybe someone's done that. That would be interesting. So, thank you.